Hello and welcome back to Modern Leader, the podcast. I am joined today by the wonderful Clare Josa of Ditching Imposter Syndrome, the book that we actually referenced on episode 43, I think it was. So welcome, Clare.
Hi, Emma.
So happy to have you on here. By way of a bit of background, Clare is considered a global authority on imposter syndrome, the author of 8 books, an expert in the neuroscience and psychology of performance. Her original training as an engineer specializing in Six Sigma and lean manufacturing means her inspirational approach is grounded in practical common sense, creating breakthroughs, not burnout. So happy to have you on. It's funny actually seeing Six Sigma and lean in there because we tried doing this in the insurance world.
Okay.
It didn't really translate, but that was a long time ago in a past life. And with that, I'd love to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself and talk about, I guess, that past life for you, because you did also have a career in corporate before you made it your life's work to become that leading authority on imposter syndrome. So tell us about that, like how you experienced it and what's led you to doing this work in the world.
So I quit the engineering career I loved due to imposter syndrome, but I had no idea at the time that's what it was. So it was back in 2001, and I was one of just 2 women on a shop floor engineering staff of 200. There was a huge amount of Me Too going on back then. Won't get into the details on that. I'm sure you and I could do a whole separate episode.
For sure.
Yeah. So it was taking a lot of courage to show up every day, but I was doing really well. I'd been promoted faster than most of my peers, but every single night I was lying awake at 3 in the morning thinking, what if today is the day my luck runs out? What if today is the day they find out I'm a fraud? I've pulled the wool over their eyes. They made a mistake in hiring me. I don't have a clue what I'm doing. And then I decided somehow, I mean, this is affecting my home life. My relationship was struggling. My GP wanted to put me on antidepressants. My overworking, I was regularly doing 14-hour days. And there just came a crunch point where I thought, you know what, I'm going to go on a sabbatical. And when I come back, it will all be better. Yeah. And I hear this now from the client organizations I work with. Their leave of absence and sabbatical rates are going through the roof. And a lot of it is people who are in the position I was in of feeling this way, not having a name for it, not having people they can go to for help to clear this out, let alone to cope with it. So I went traveling. I spent a year traveling in New Zealand and South America. I studied Spanish. I came back and they offered me my old job back as something deep inside went, no, because nothing had changed apart from me. By a whole string of the universe conspiring, I became head of market research for one of the world's most disruptive brands. And this was a job that on paper I had no qualifications for. I had guerrilla market research expertise. I should have felt like an imposter. It was gone. So this thing I didn't even know there was a name for, I no longer had. I studied while I was there. I was studying psychology. I became an NLP trainer. I was doing all sorts of other stuff, including became a Reiki master teacher. And after a few years, I realized I couldn't make a big enough difference in someone else's business making bits of shiny plastic, which is what we were doing. And I realized that actually what really made me get out of bed in the morning was making people smile. Yeah, back in the factory days, my nickname had been Smiler, because that was kind of my mission. Is before I got to the coffee place each morning, I had to see how many people on the shop floor I could get smiling.
I love
Yeah,
that.
is lifting their mood. So I set up my own leadership development business, and the first 20 or so executive clients I worked with all had that thing that I'd had back in 2001. And so it set me on a mission because I had an incredible toolkit, but all I could do was give them more and more bizarre and elaborate coping strategies. It wasn't clearing it out at the root cause level. That's when I realized it had a name. It was imposter syndrome. That's when I realized when I was traveling, I ditched it and it was gone. And I had no idea what I'd done, how I'd got to that point. So I used the NLP trainer skills to model what I'd done. I used my engineering Six Sigma skills to look at those key bits of the process, and spent quite a few years experimenting, developing a process that I could teach to others to then share with others to help them create breakthroughs in people that I will never meet. That's where the natural resilience method was born. And that has now helped tens of thousands of people around the world.
Amazing. It's amazing. I love hearing that. And why don't we, like, we have covered this in previous episodes, but why don't you, in your words, give us like a brief kind of overview of what imposter syndrome is and isn't, so that
Mhm.
someone listening can recognize it in themselves. And also, I love, I've actually just re-listened to your book, and I remembered the bit around um you don't have, and you, or you don't, you do, it's not I am an imposter. That piece is
Mhm.
like you do imposter. So if we can like go
Okay.
into that a little bit.
Perfect. So I define imposter syndrome as the secret fear of being found out as not good enough or a fraud, despite external world evidence that you're doing well. Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is why, if you're experiencing imposter syndrome, or you've got someone in your team or a client that's running it, you can give them all the pep talks in the world. It doesn't get through the filters in the brain. They're still important, but they don't last. What lasts is any perception of critique that gets taken on as a badge of honor and a sense of identity. So it's that fear of being found out. That is the secret sauce. I have another definition of it that I often use with clients and students, which is often a light bulb moment for them, which is it's the secret fear of others judging us the way we judge ourselves.
Mm.
And this is why the mindset stuff on its own isn't enough for imposter syndrome. It's why you need the deeper work, because that judging is down there in our identity, our sense of self, of who am I? Yeah. So
Yeah.
any piece of feedback becomes really personal about who we are. And it means that someone running imposter syndrome is hardwired to look for those threats, to look for the risk of attack, and to self-sabotage in order to stay safe. It's a very primal thing that's running, but it's context dependent. So somebody might be crippled by imposter syndrome at work, but be absolutely fine in the supermarket.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's not who we are. It is like a pattern that we're running, a program we're running. It is a coping strategy from the primal part of the brain and the body to keep us safe. And it can be so context dependent. It can be as nuanced as a certain person has to be in the room. And if they're in the room, you're running imposter syndrome. And if they're not, you're fine. So a lot of
Mm-hmm.
the clients I've worked with over the years are, they're on stage regularly for their organization for work, and they come across as hugely confident. But if that certain person is in the room, inside they are quaking.
Mm-hmm.
And because it's something that we do, like a pattern that we run, rather than a thing that we have that we hold on to that is part of us, it means we can let it go when we've got the
Mm-hmm.
right tools.
Yeah, I love that. And just as you were talking, I had so many flashbacks about resonating with that person in the room. Like, and it, for me, it wasn't even necessarily a certain person. It was like if they were more senior than me, I had that like crumbling feeling inside.
Yeah.
And I definitely, I talk a lot about wearing that mask of fake confidence, right? Like,
Mhm.
it wasn't until I left the corporate world and started talking about some of these things that I was experiencing that people were coming forward and saying I had no idea, like nada. So
Mhm.
so it's our, I guess our biggest dirty little secret at times, isn't it? Because we don't speak about it. But I know you've also done the white papers, and like
Mhm.
give us some headline stats on like what we're dealing with here in the workplace. And also I'm fascinated about men and women, because
Mhm.
we think it's more of a female thing, but actually
Mhm.
you can prove us wrong in that, can't you?
Absolutely. So one of the things, we were about to publish the 2024 imposter syndrome research study. So some sneak previews here.
Yes.
Imposter syndrome rates have gone up by a fifth since the start of the pandemic. Okay. That is actually quite shocking, because it means that for women, they're now at 62% have experienced imposter syndrome daily or regularly in the past year, to a level that's affecting their well-being and their performance. So if you look around a typical meeting room, that is getting close to 2/3 of the women in that room have been
Mhm.
experiencing this. But because it's about our sense of self and judging and identity, we feel shame. And so we try incredibly hard to hide it. Yeah.
Mhm.
The figure for men, so 62% for women. For men, it's 59%.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's near as what's it the same. The
Wow.
thing is, they handle it very differently. So the
Mhm.
men we found are much more likely to push on down that fear, to push on through, to take the action anyway, which sounds great until you realize that they're then 5 times more likely than women to turn to drugs, alcohol, and medication to cope with the stress and anxiety that that causes.
Mhm.
And this has even been shown to be a key factor in a lot of, unfortunately, suicides for senior men. So this actually is still traumatizing for them. It's just they're hiding it, that stiff upper lip.
Mhm.
Women, we found, are 20 times more likely than men to talk about it, which is one
Okay.
of the reasons why we think it's
Mhm.
women. Is because there is so much shame in a man admitting that kind of vulnerability. Whereas for women at the moment, culturally, that's much more acceptable. And it's also the women out there in the ED&I networks, for example, organizing the events on
Mhm.
imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
And sometimes I will actually refuse to speak, to be a keynote speaker at an event, if they haven't also invited men to that meeting, because otherwise it's reinforcing in the leadership team's eyes that this is a woman-only problem. It's not. Women handle it differently. We're more likely to experience a strong fear-based emotion.
Mhm.
We're more likely then to hold back as our coping strategy rather than pushing on through. And one of the stats that we're still working on, but it's a real shocker, 76% of women with home carer responsibilities have experienced imposter syndrome daily or regularly in the past year. So it's much higher if you've got a family member or a child that you're also helping, yeah,
Mhm.
and responsible for, in addition to your work. And part of this is the mental load. Yeah, it's that mental load of, unfortunately, it is still mainly the women doing the spinning plates for the family and their work. That mental load means they're constantly in something called hypervigilance, on the lookout for threats, things going wrong, preventing problems. That increases the whole stress response in the body, and that amplifies imposter syndrome.
Yeah. Wow. They are shocking
Yes.
statistics.
And most organizations don't even have a policy for what to do with imposter syndrome, let alone an actual process and strategy to support. Back in my engineering days, had there been one single person out of that company of 1,000 that knew what imposter syndrome was, where I knew I could go and talk to them and get help to clear it,
Yeah.
I would never have left my engineering career. Yeah, I wouldn't now do what I do. Yeah, so
Yeah.
swings and roundabouts.
Yeah.
But I'm not alone. Yeah, the stats are also showing that 1 in 10 people is thinking of quitting their job due to imposter syndrome or burnout every single day.
Wow.
Yeah.
Kind of hard to wrap your head around. In one sense, when you were talking, I was thinking, oh, if I'd have, like, it's almost like you can take comfort in knowing that in that boardroom where I'm sitting there going, go on, say it, share the idea, and I'm not because I'm too
They're thinking it
afraid of
too.
putting it out
Yeah.
there. Then there's 7 other people out these 10 people that are also having the same thought. You can
Yeah.
kind of take a bit of comfort in that, but that's obviously not a solution. So what would you love to see? And I know you work with not just individuals but
Mm.
organizations. So what would you love to see more of become standard in terms of like the support that is there, or just the awareness for
Mm.
one, I guess.
So the first thing is removing the taboo. Okay. I remember a few years ago doing a keynote for a very large organization. It was at the beginning of lockdown. And so we were all online, which was quite a new experience for the people on the receiving end. And we got to the end of this session. I'd done the keynote, I'd facilitated a panel discussion. And you know what it's like when you've done sort of 90 minutes of something where you're giving a lot of energy, is you're just like, please let me now go and hide under the table in my slippers for a cup of tea. And the CEO did the wrap up and said, with the greatest respect, and we all know what's following that, he said, I have no idea why we've just wasted the last 90
Oh,
minutes on this. You've just got to pull your socks up. This is just a badge of honor for poor performance.
oh,
And I sort of stood there and went, camera off. Yeah. And we can laugh about it now, but that organization, the shame that was invoked in that moment, the lack of permission to ask for help was huge. I ran an event for my own tribe yesterday for International Women's Day for 600 people. They asked me questions up front. They were allowed to ask one question. 10% of them were, how do I talk to my boss about this?
mm,
Okay. So for 10% of that 600 people, it was their biggest question is, how do I tell my boss? Removing that taboo. So my big dream is that we approach it from two sides. Is one, we remove the taboo to make it as acceptable to ask for help with imposter syndrome as it is with Microsoft Office. Yeah, it's stuff we're not born knowing how to do. We need to ask for help. On the other hand, I also have a dream that all organizations are dealing with the three pillars of imposter syndrome, which our research shows are the culture, the environment, and the personal habits. And you need to deal with all three. I can do the work. Yeah, I can work with organizations on culture and environment, but with individuals, I can start with the habits to empower them to clear out the stuff that meant imposter syndrome's hanging around.
Yeah.
And then when you change the culture and the habits, it's a very different experience. You're doing it from a place of grounded confidence rather than terror, anger, and frustration. Yeah.
Yeah.
But in organizations, we've got to stop pretending that this isn't there. That's the biggest response I'm seeing. Or that an organization, bless their hearts, is putting it on the shoulders of the well-being committee of volunteers who've got no training in this stuff. How are they meant to do anything other than ask Google what to do? And Google doesn't normally hold the answers on this. Yeah. Or one of my clients, she's actually a student on my Master Coach certification program. She's a mental health first aider, and she found her face on a poster behind the photocopier saying, hey, if you're feeling stressed, worried, anxious, imposter syndrome, burnout, here are the people to go and chat with. So she's actually being used as an untrained, unsupported counselor. And I'm seeing that in a lot of organizations. They've lost the understanding that mental health first aiders are about catch and pass in a crisis. And actually what we need to be doing is the upstream work to prevent the vast majority ever getting to the crisis. Nobody should be thinking about quitting their job due to imposter syndrome and burnout. We need to start upstream. Yes, catch the people who are close to the crisis point, but then start upstream to prevent people getting there in the first place.
Yeah, love that. And so I love the work that you're doing and good luck with that. And hopefully we see a big shift in our lifetime, right? That's the goal. But back to, and I want to come back to the 1 in 10 that want to leave. Before we do, you mentioned the habits on an individual level. Like, what are some of those?
Okay.
Where do you start to look at change?
So one of the first things is there's a link between, well, basically the body feels every thought we think. And if you're running imposter syndrome, you're very likely to have a very well-tamed and trained inner critic that's really good at pointing out everything that you're going to do wrong. Your body then fires off the same stress-based fear responses as it would if you were actually in danger in the outside physical world. So it fires off the fight, flight, freeze response, which creates all of our coping strategies then. That's self-sabotage, and all of the other things we do to feel safe despite imposter syndrome. So when I'm working with people, we actually start with pressing pause. You've got to be able to press pause on the stress cycle. You can't do inner change work if you're completely wired, stressed, worried, scared. Yeah. So get people back in now feeling safe. Then we look at the thought processes, the beauty of neuroplasticity, being able to rewire the brain to change its filters so that you spot what you're doing well, not just what you're doing badly. The third stage, if I'm working with people, helping them on the habit stuff, is actually then clearing the body's secret addiction to adrenaline, because the body gets addicted to the stress hormones, meaning you can do mindset work, but then like a dandelion, the body pops back up from between the cracks on that paving slab saying, I'm a bit tired, I haven't had a cortisol hit lately. Here are some drama thoughts, yeah?
Yeah.
So we do that. So then you've already made huge progress. And at that point, the next stage is about stepping back into your personal power, resetting those toxic boundaries. But it's done from a place of calm groundedness rather than the resentment we might feel for having overgiven as people pleasers, for example, or having given too much time to something if we're procrastinating or running perfectionism. And then the final stage of the process is about becoming the real you. So that is taking off what you were describing just now, Emma, as the masks, is doing that deeper work to feel safe showing up without the masks and the armor so that you can be who you really are. And that then becomes contagious because you're giving other people permission to do the same. And so we call that the natural resilience method. That's what I reverse engineered from what I did actually in Argentina and Peru in that year traveling. And it's designed that we can go around it a number of times as layers, because the last thing you want to do if somebody is really in chronic stress and anxiety due to something like imposter syndrome and they're close to burnout, you don't want to be doing the existential stuff yet. You need to help them gently, layer by layer, to deal with those inner habits, to allow that change to settle,
Yeah.
and so that they can create that shift and transformation at a pace that feels right and safe for them, that also allows the outside world to readjust, because you're going to be setting new boundaries. You're going to be saying no where you used to say yes. You're going to be speaking up with your ideas. And that is what gets me so excited about this work, Emma, is when I've got students who've trained on the coaching program telling me that their clients are saying, my boss said, what have you been doing? You're so different. It's great. And these are people I will never meet. Yeah. They
Yep.
will probably never even know my name. But this ripple effect of being able to kind of spread this,
Yeah.
it is huge, absolutely huge. So that's the kind of thing that we're achieving with the habits. We're doing in the moment stuff because sometimes you need an emergency fix, but also the preventative stuff to clear out the root causes. Good old, you can take the girl out of engineering, but you can't take engineering out of the girl, yeah?
Yeah. Oh my God. I love that. And I love hearing about the ripple effect and the impact that you're actually making. It's potentially way beyond you'll ever be able to fathom,
Yeah.
which is amazing. Um, and again, as you were talking about the habits, I was like, oh my God, yeah. Like that inner critic for me, has even reared her ugly head more recently. And it's interesting because as I turn 45 this week, I am learning what part compassion needs
Mm.
to play in this, right? It's like actually my inner critic still sounds like a proper right old bitch. And actually it's time, if anything, it's time for me to have more compassion for myself, and in the same way that I have for my clients, my friends, my peoples, like I've got a lot of compassion for other people and what their inner talk is like, and it's almost like it's time to do that for myself on a bigger level, and that's got to play a big part in it, right, in terms of like being able to live with this inner critic.
It's actually about rewiring it. So one of the things, I have an app called Imposter Syndrome Hacks. And one of the things we get people doing in their first few days is a process I call micro wins.
Right.
And it takes about a minute and you do it once a day. And within a week to 2 weeks, you're already retuning that inner radio station. You're already changing the tone of voice of that inner critic. It's starting to become more balanced, because what's happening when we're full on inner critic is we've changed the filters in the brain to drown out anything from the outside world that says we're good enough, or to say anything positive about our performance. We're waiting for the but, because that's what we've rehearsed inside. So things like the Imposter Syndrome Hacks micro wins process can help you to expand those filters to also spot what you're doing well. And that starts to make it more of an evenly balanced dialogue. Then there's other stuff we can do on the neuroplasticity that actually starts taking out a lot of that what if thing, because that's what the inner critic often is
Yeah.
the catastrophizing, is you said this, well, what if he now thinks that about you? It's about being able to press pause on those thoughts, because when we think the thoughts, it fires off biochemical reactions in the body. That triggers our experience of emotions, that feeds more of the thoughts, and it becomes this spiral. When you can press pause right at the beginning, you don't have to go through that whole fight, flight, freeze response.
Yeah.
You actually stay on a much more even keel. And it only takes a few minutes a day for a few weeks to start creating shifts that other people notice. Yeah, that's how big they are.
And I can get so much hope from hearing that, right? Because it's not something we have to live with, and it's
Correct.
like it's great. There is hope for us all. So
Definitely.
thank you for doing this work in the world. Um, and all of this is in the book as well, right? This, if you get
Yeah.
the book, you get like the abridged version of like how to
Mm.
start working on this for yourself, and then there are many other resources that you can dive in deeper, which we're going to share at the end.
Yeah.
Um, but I want to go back to this, like 1 in 10 are
Mm.
every day thinking
Mm.
about leaving their work. And you and I both were in a similar situation, right? We both left. I perhaps had the vocabulary of imposter syndrome in my mind. I'd actually been through a leadership development program in-house.
Mm.
And I think the first realization that actually it was probably written all over my face what I was thinking on the inside, was when one of the facilitators took me to one side and suggested I should have got it out. It's my first self-help book was actually what she suggested, which was Tame Your Gremlin.
Yeah.
And it was like this, so this next, like, that was sort of set me on this path of like discovering more and more about what was going on inside for me. So I kind of did have a little bit of that language. And yet when I left to go and do this kind of new thing, to set up my own business to kind of help others in the situation that I'd been in, imposter syndrome didn't leave me because my environment changed, because my focus changed. In fact, I probably had a bit of, you know, beginner's enthusiasm, and like I had all this shiny new objects. I was free. I didn't have a 9 to 5 anymore. And I got my first few clients really easily, like just naturally. And then it hit, and I was like, oh, here I am back here again. So talk a bit about that, because obviously the transition piece is like where we're going to focus on the next series, whether that's, you know, transitioning into a senior leadership role, or transitioning into another company, or moving yourself across the world with your company, or leaving your company to go and set up on your own, or do something totally different, or even retirement, right? Even that sort of transition. So what are your thoughts around that, and how imposter syndrome kind of follows us around?
Okay. So my first novel was called You Take Yourself With You for exactly this reason. Okay. And we can change, as you say, the culture and the environment on the outside, but we've still got us on the inside. And you can have, you know, when you're setting up your own business, there is that initial thrill, and then there's the, oh, what have I done? Yeah. And if I look at the stats for solopreneurs, so people who are running a business that's mainly about them, yeah, rather than selling things,
Yeah.
Imposter syndrome rates are 82%.
Wow. Okay. So
Okay, so it's
higher.
even higher than lawyers. It is the most extreme profession for imposter syndrome. And we never mention imposter syndrome in our exit interviews. Yeah, nobody sits there going, I'm leaving because I've got this thing called imposter syndrome and I feel like a fake and a fraud, because then you'd be prepared to, you know, people would persuade you to stay. They'd be like, right, okay, let's sort this out. So that transition into entrepreneurship, it becomes about selling us to a certain extent. We're selling ourselves. We are the brand. That exacerbates imposter syndrome. When you're looking at any kind of transition, anything that changes our sense of identity and self risks bringing up previously dormant imposter syndrome. So I talk about the imposter syndrome gap between who we see ourselves as being and who we think we need to be to do or achieve something. And we build, to bridge that gap, what I call the bridge of coping strategies, all the things we do to succeed despite imposter syndrome. When we have that transition, either our sense of who we are changes, or our sense of who we need to be changes. That gap widens, the bridge falls into the ravine. And we've got a choice. We either put a huge amount of energy into building a better bridge of coping strategies to span the wider gap, or we self-sabotage and we walk away. Yeah. And we just wait too long to return that call, or we suggest somebody else for that beautiful visibility opportunity that our heart was actually crying for. So this is why transitions can cause previously dormant or previously coped with imposter syndrome to suddenly be in your face. And it is the single biggest reason why I see women coming to work with my master coaches for help, is they've just been promoted into a role where their old coping strategies for imposter syndrome are not enough. And they've decided, my favorite Italian word is basta. It's like pasta with a B, basta. They've decided kind of basta, enough. I have to do something about this. I cannot continue pretending this is okay. There has to be something I can do other than just coping with this.
Yeah. And it's great that there are now resources out there to help that, but still not enough on a big enough global scale, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also, it affects women in particular at other points. There are other key transitions that can trigger imposter syndrome, like returning from maternity leave is a huge one. And I'd love to see organizations being proactive, having support for women returning from maternity leave, because so often you feel like you've been out of it for over a year. The rest of the world has moved on. And not only do you need to work out how on earth do I manage to work while I've got this bundle of nappies and screaming poo to deal with outside of work. You know, love our kids, but you know, it's a whole different way of living. you've got that, and you've also got anything, you know, that change in sense of identity and self will trigger imposter syndrome in a really big way. And I see so many women not coming back from maternity leave because they can't get the flexible working they now need, and because imposter syndrome is now just too big an issue for them. And
Mm,
another really big one for women is menopause.
yeah.
Yeah, is the fog brain, the insomnia, so many of the other symptoms mean it does actually affect our performance sometimes. You know, being standing on, I've done it myself, standing on stage and a word goes, and you're like, and I just joke about it now, going, anybody else perimenopausal here? Yeah? Get a
Yeah.
laugh from the audience and just, you know, we're just going to go off on this tangent. And if this one comes back to me, I'll let you know. But it actually takes real guts to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the shame that people feel over how menopause is affecting them means that it can trigger previously dormant imposter syndrome. We're seeing huge numbers of women. I think it is something like 1 in 10 is quitting their career due to menopause, and imposter syndrome is playing a huge role in that.
Wow.
Mm.
Yeah, it's interesting you should say that, because I've got an expert lined up to talk about perimenopause, because myself feel like I'm going into that transition as we speak as
Yeah.
well. And it's real. It's like there's so many transitions. And I guess that's the other thing with women versus men, is that the transitions that we tend to go through in our identity, just through the natural course of life, tend to be, I don't know, more radical
And more public.
and more public. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. And kind of, I guess men get a bad rep because they just, like, they go to work and they come home, they sleep, and they go to work again. And that's not to belittle them, but
Mm.
it does feel like sometimes they do have it a bit easier, or they just have this one thing to do because they're on this career trajectory.
Mm.
But not to take away the fact that, as we heard earlier, they actually are still experiencing it in their own way as well. um
Exactly.
yeah, amazing, crazy, amazing, all the things. So for me, the modern leader is really an identity, I guess, that it's my wish for, I think, a lot of people, women in particular, that are in that position that I was in, or are potentially thinking about transitioning into doing their own thing, following their kind of passion and purpose in life
Mm.
at this kind of later stage at life, where they're kind of assessing things. and and for me, it's someone that, she knows herself and
Mm.
she brings her whole self to the table. And I think in just talking about this, it brings up some of the real challenges of bringing our whole self to the table in the environments and the cultures that we kind of are working in oftentimes. So back to the work that you're doing with the
Mm.
corporations, with the organizations. um if someone's here listening and they're in HR or something like that, they're in a position where they can influence bringing more awareness to their organization, what would you say to them in terms of, like, what they could do next, what action they can take next?
Okay, so if we're going to work with an organization on this, we would normally start by actually doing an assessment, an audit. Let's quantify. We've got research-backed quiz-style tools we can use, so you know how big an issue it is. So you know how much a priority it does or doesn't need to be. And that can give you data on both the habits, but also the culture and the environment, because there will always be quick wins. There will always be things you can do right away that start to make a difference. And that huge benefit is not just the difference it makes, it tells everybody in the organization, we mean this. And there is a direct link between imposter syndrome and burnout. So anything you do to clear imposter syndrome in the organization also reduces the risk of losing people to burnout, and the productivity hit that has too.
Yes.
So we start by measuring. Anybody who is in really dire need of help, we would recommend they use a certified external coach, just get them the support they need right away. And that doesn't have to be hugely expensive. There are hybrid options where it's a blend of training and coaching for that real breakthrough stuff. Then I actually want to make myself redundant. Okay. So every time I work with anyone, my first thought is, right, how can I engineer myself so they don't need me?
Mhm.
So I do that with organizations, is who in your team would be brilliant to get trained in these methods to actually have the skills that people can then come to. And in 3, 4, 5 sessions, they have made such a huge difference in clearing imposter syndrome that it's just not an issue for them anymore.
Yeah.
And to make that scalable, because these people will be doing that probably alongside their normal job, it's looking at things like the Imposter Syndrome Hacks app. So we've got enterprise licenses for that. So anybody in the team that scored more than a certain amount on the assessment can be offered the app, which means in 5 minutes a day, they can be making progress on clearing out those habits, or they can spend more time if they want to. It's amazing how much doom scrolling time we've got that we could use on this. So that gives you something that's really scalable, and that means you can help hundreds for the cost of coaching a handful. But you're
Mm.
self-sufficient. Yeah. We'll still be there supporting your coaches. That's where we're putting the support in, is because they do need the coaching supervision, someone to talk to, someone to bounce ideas with. They need a community to help them to be as effective as they can be. But you're not constantly having to send me purchase orders for yet more one-to-one work.
Yeah. Brilliant. I love that. And actually just a note on International Women's Day, which you mentioned up front, because you and I connected on LinkedIn over this. I had no idea that, this whole Inspire Inclusion this year that was,
Oh,
with the love heart hands, was not actually the official theme for this year. And it was actually invest in women.
exactly.
Go on.
Invest in women. I mean,
Okay.
one of the other things that we can do, if you've got a women leadership team or a team in the making, your future leaders, is we have to look at what do the women need that the men already have. Yeah. So one of the things I really love doing is actually leading masterminds for groups of, say, about 12 women, where each month they can have a taught session where they learn some of this stuff about clearing out their inner stuff. But then once they've dealt with the imposter syndrome, we move then into the softer kind of influencing skills, and how to be authentic and how to really play to your strengths, even if the C-suite is still kind of fairly alpha male and pretty competitive, is how to be yourself, whatever the culture and the environment, and how to be the best leader you can be. And when you think about what it costs to rehire somebody who quits, yeah, the investment is so tiny in comparison. And what we found with the research is one of the biggest reasons why a woman will leave her job, even if she loves the company and her teams, in order to get into a leadership or a senior leadership role, is that she's worried about the shame and embarrassment if she doesn't get it and everybody knew she went for it. So women will leave a company they love and apply externally for that leadership promotion because of imposter syndrome. Whereas what we found is the men tended to launch a bit of an in-house campaign to explain why they were the best candidate. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll never forget. I went to my first women's network event for GE at the time that I was working
Yeah.
for. And the CEO of GE kind of walked in with all his security. And he basically said, the feedback I got from last night's dinner, which was, there was, I think, say 150 of us there,
Yeah.
from the managers, the leaders of his team that he put in there to be at dinner with us, was that at the end of the night, when the bus came, all you women got up with your handbags and totted off like good little girls to the bus. I mean, we're going back 20 years here, but
Yeah.
he said, and all that was left was the men at the bar. And this is the opportunity the guys take to get their promotions and to put the word in for themselves. And it was like, I mean, there's probably a better way of saying it, but it kind of proved a point that we tend to do that as women as well, don't we? We don't necessarily put ourselves out there in the same way that men do to be in front of mind to get those opportunities in the first place for the reasons that you've just said.
And it's still happening. I ran a women's network event about 3 years ago for a major organization, and there was drinks afterwards. And during the drinks, a couple of the senior female leaders were talking about a new role that was becoming open. And they were talking about, well, who should we invite to apply? It was a very senior level role. And every name they mentioned was a man. And I pointed out to them, we're here at the Women's Network event. There must be a woman you can think of for this role. And they all just looked at me and went, nope. Because one of the coping strategies we're using as women with imposter syndrome is not being visible. It's not speaking up with our ideas. 89% of female respondents said they do not feel fully confident speaking up with their ideas.
Yeah.
We're not going for those opportunities to shine. When we're praised, we will often deflect that praise onto our team, whereas the men tended to own the praise. Yeah. So the men were talking about I, the women were talking about we. And
Mm.
it's this, I suppose this is the modern equivalent of that late night at the bar. Back in my corporate days, it was actually the smoking room, because that's where all the senior leaders went for their fag breaks, and that's where you knew you had to go if you wanted to get promoted. So only the smokers got promoted. Yeah.
True. Yeah.
Luckily, the smoking rooms are gone now. But these self-sabotage techniques that we're using disproportionately disadvantage women. And we found that imposter syndrome is one of 3 hidden drivers in the gender pay gap. The other 2 are the alpha male culture at the most senior levels of too many organizations still, and the lack of flexible working, meaning women feel they've got to choose between their career and their loved ones.
Yeah. So we still have a long way to go, right?
But we can do it. We can
We
do
can
it.
do
Yeah.
it.
And
We can do
things like
it.
the United Nations theme of invest in women is a very in-your-face call to action. Yeah,
Yeah.
that could be interpreted in so many ways. And in our current Western culture, certainly here in the UK, it really is about looking at what is it in the culture and the environment of an organization that could be disadvantaging women, like mandated return to the office for a woman that simply cannot get childcare to cover the hours needed for the commute now, because the childminders all went bust over COVID.
Mm.
Yeah, it's that kind of thing. You know, my husband can only do the job he does because I run my own business and I generally work from home, meaning I've got much more flexibility on topping and tailing the day. And I can be there if school calls and, hey, your son's fallen over or he's just vomited, or yeah.
Yeah.
It's almost
Yeah.
like I'm a housewife and the business owner. But if I were also in London,
Yeah.
we couldn't,
Yeah.
we'd need a nanny.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. Claire, I could talk to you for hours. We've been joined by Buddy, who's getting
Oh,
hungry, I think. I'm very conscious of your time, so I want to wrap it up here and say thank you so much. Tell us, I know you've got some resources to point our listeners to. Tell us where they can find those.
fantastic. Well, Emma, it's been an absolute joy to hang out with you today. Thank you. And I hope everybody listening and watching has found this useful. So if you go to clarejosa.com, Modern Leader, then I've got 2 things waiting there for you. One is actually one of my scorecard research-backed assessments. It's about a 30-question quiz. It'll give you your imposter syndrome score, and it'll tell you which of the 3 core drivers you need to start work on and give you a personalized action plan with some first steps. So you could get started today. And also for anybody listening or watching on that page, if you actually want to deeply dive in and just say, basta is right, I'm going to deal with imposter syndrome. I am not taking it with me whatever I'm doing next. I'm gifting everybody 30 free days access to the Imposter Syndrome Hacks app. And
Oh,
that's on that page as
amazing.
well.
Thank you so much. That is such a gift. Thank you. I will link to that in the show notes, of course. Thank you again, Claire. It's been great chatting to you, and I can't wait to see what you do next in the world. Good luck with the impact you are here to make.
Thank
And
you, Emma.
take care, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.